I'm Bruce Gordon. During the Cold War, my friend Lloyd Kenworthy made a daring incursion into Soviet airspace to gather intelligence on Soviet Chaff. But first, I have to tell you what Chaff is and why it was worth Lloyd risking his life to get the information. During World War II, we developed Chaff to confuse German radars so they couldn't vector their fighters in to intercept our bombers. Chaff is basically long strips of metal foil, which, when dropped from an airplane, looks to the radar like other airplanes. The first time a German radar operator saw the airplanes suddenly creating thousands of new airplanes, he commented, "The enemy are reproducing themselves." Ideally, the chaff would be the same length as the wavelength of the radar you're trying to jam, such as several meters long. But we discovered that it could be only a fraction of the wavelength, but it had to be a precise multiple of the wavelength. So the piece of chaff was cut to the length of the radar you wanted to jam, and at other frequencies, it was not as effective. Chaff has some inherent problems. As soon as you dropped chaff, it stopped in the air, and the bomber kept going. So soon there was a lateral separation between the bundle of chaff and the airplane that dropped it. The chaff also would slowly fall, so that any bombers following that wanted to be in the chaff stream had to come in at a lower altitude. You could create a chaff stream by sending the first bombers at a high altitude and bringing the next waves of bombers at lower altitudes so they could stay in the chaff stream. The pilots couldn't see the chaff stream. They had to calculate what altitude it would be at. And then every now and then you'd have to have more bombers laying more chaff to create a wider chaff stream so that the following bombers would be hidden from the radar anti-aircraft, so the anti-aircraft guns could not find the correct altitude to set their fusing. During the 1950s, the Russians developed chaff that didn't fall as fast as ours and had more reflection than ours, so they could create large chaff corridors, and we couldn't see any airplanes that were flying in their chaff corridors. In 1956, Hungary was ruled by a communist government. The people of Hungary revolted, threw out the communist government, and Russia decided to do something about it. During the night of November 10th, 1956, the Russians started creating a huge chaff corridor over Eastern Europe. Our radar operators in Germany looked at the chaff corridor, and we knew the Russians were up to something, but we couldn't see what was in the chaff corridor, and we didn't do anything about it. If we had been able to see into the chaff corridor, we would have been able to see an armada of Russian aircraft, transports carrying troops for an invasion of Hungary. The first Russian aircraft posed as civilian commercial planes, but when they landed, they disgorged special forces which promptly took over the airports. They were followed by a stream of military transports unloading large numbers of Russian troops into the middle of Hungary. This was complemented by a direct invasion across the Hungarian border by Russian mechanized forces. In a matter of about 1 day, Hungary was overrun by Russian troops. The Chaff corridor had blinded Western intelligence from knowing what the Russians were up to and left us with no time to react. We realized that the Russians were ahead of us on Chaff and we needed to catch up. Lloyd Kenworthy was flying F-102s out of West Germany when he got an unusual order to go deep into Soviet airspace to get readings on a Soviet chaff stream. Lloyd was to tune his radar to the maximum return on the chaff and then return to base where intelligence could compute the characteristics of the Soviet chaff. The Soviets were having a big exercise in Eastern Europe and had laid a very large chaff corridor. Lloyd and his wingman took off on a clear moonless night, climbed to 30,000 feet, and headed deep into Soviet airspace. 2 MiGs came out to meet him. They didn't have radar, and he did, so he was able to evade them at night and continued on 100 miles deep into Soviet airspace. 6 more MiGs came out to meet him, but he saw them on radar and evaded them too. Soon he entered the chaff stream and tuned his radar as he had been directed. Lloyd and his wingman stayed in the chaff corridor for a while, tuning their radars. While they were there, the Russians couldn't pick him up on their radar either, so he was safe. When he turned toward home, 6 more MiGs came out to meet him, but he picked them up on radar and evaded them in the dark also. When he got back to base, intelligence swarmed his plane and secured the data that he had gathered. Lloyd and his wingman had risked their lives to gather intelligence on the Soviet chaff. Another example of the Cold War and the spirit of attack.